Our first speaker today is Sarah Deer, a member of the Muscogee Creek Nation and a lawyer, scholar, and author. Sarah is a professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at the University of Kansas. She's also the Chief Justice for the Prairie Island Indian Community Court of Appeals. She has worked to end violence against women for more than 25 years. And in 2014, Sarah was named a prestigious MacArthur Fellow. Sarah will speak today about historical resilience, the story of violence against Native women. Sarah?
There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I am just thrilled that the museum has decided to provide a forum for us. We don't have very many forums, and it feels, it's an honor. It's a real honor to be asked to be here today. I have a presentation today that walks through some of the history. The history is brutal, the history is uncomfortable, but I also want to leave you with a sense of hope because we're still here, and Native women will always be here. So bear with me as I go through some difficult material. I think it will be worth it to watch some of this difficult information on the screen that I'm about to show you. According to the Department of Justice, the federal government's own statistics show that over 84% of Native women will be victims of violence in their lifetime. The same study showed that over half of Native women have experienced sexual violence. We used to say 1 in 3, that was the data we had a few years ago, and now we know it's much higher than that, 1 in 2. When I travel to Indian reservations around the country, though, I almost always hear that these numbers seem a little conservative, a little bit low. In fact, we go to a lot of reservations, people will say, I don't know any Native woman who has not been a victim of sexual violence. The rate of post-traumatic stress disorder among Native adults is 4.5 times the national average. Over almost 30% of Native Two-Spirit, that's our Native LGBTQ brothers and sisters, have been victims of a hate crime. And over 85% of lesbian, bisexual, Two-Spirit Native women have been victims of sexual violence. These crimes are happening both on and off the reservation. In one study in Seattle, released just very recently, a study concluded that 94% of the Native women they spoke to in Seattle had been victims of sexual violence. One of the most important things to understand in terms of the law is that tribal nations are prohibited from prosecuting non-Indians for almost every single crime imaginable. There's a small exception at this point for certain tribes to prosecute non-Indians who commit acts of domestic violence on the reservations. But we still lack criminal authority over sexual violence, child sexual abuse, and even homicide. The next question I usually get asked at this point is why? Why are the numbers as high as they are? I think to understand the story of these numbers, we must understand the story of tribal nations who have been here for thousands and thousands of years. We often talk about tribal sovereignty, but we don't often break that down into what it really means. What is tribal sovereignty? Tribal sovereignty is the same kind of sovereignty that any government is entitled to. The right to make laws and be governed by them. The right to make decisions about what happens in their communities and to pass laws that address concerns and challenges in that community. Unfortunately, tribal sovereignty in this nation has been under attack and is still under attack today. When I talk to survivors of sexual assault, one of the things that I often hear are very similar parallels to what's happened to them as to what I understand to have happened to Native nations as well. And so I also think about sovereignty of the soul, the sovereignty of the individual, to make decisions about what happens to them, to make decisions about what happens to their bodies. And I believe that that sovereignty is tied to the sovereignty of tribal nations. We had systems of laws and systems of governance for thousands of years, and these systems worked well for us. Traditionally, violence against women was not tolerated in indigenous societies. We had strict laws and policies that prohibited the mistreatment of women and children. Many of our tribal nations were matrilineal or matrilocal, wherein the women of that community were really the center of the family and the government. My tribe is a matrilineal tribe. That's not to say that patrilineal tribes have a tendency towards violence against women, but we have to think about the role of women in our societies and how we were protected and honored and cherished. When I was just a law student, a young Creek law student at the University of Kansas in the 1990s, one of the things that I was so excited to be able to study for the first time was the laws of our own tribe, the laws of the Muscogee people. I wanted to research how our tribe traditionally would have responded to violence against Native women and how we dealt with things like domestic violence and sexual assault and child abuse. So I started my studies in the libraries. I didn't have a funding stream to go down and talk to my tribal members of the Muscogee Nation. So I was in the libraries, and I struggled to find information about my research topic. And I gave up after a while. I went to my law professor and I said, I can't find anything in my research about how my people, the Muscogee people, had traditionally responded to violent crime against women and children. And I need to change my paper topic. And he said, I don't want you to give up just yet. He said, look and see what some of the observers of Creek people said about the way that they lived. Sometimes you have to be careful with that information because it's very Eurocentric and very racist, but every once in a while you'll find a sympathetic observer who actually got it right, who actually told the truth about what was happening. And that's when I came across the works of William Bartram, who was an American naturalist in the late 18th century, who traveled down to what is now the southeastern part of the United States to study plant and animal life. He lived among the Creek and Cherokee people for upwards of 10 years, nearly a decade, and he wrote many, many journals and wrote many, many letters to his friends who were curious about the Indians of the Southeast. So several times throughout his writings, you can find this information that he had never seen or heard of a Native man beating a Native woman or even speaking to her disrespectfully. And finding that information was so powerful for me, and it gave me hope that I could pick up my research project and keep going. So the next thing I found was our tribal nation's very first written rape law. Now, you have to understand that we were always a people of laws, but we didn't have written language in the way that we think about written language today. So all of our laws were passed orally, through ceremony, through song, through community events, and it was not within our nature to write down the laws that were sacred and powerful for our community, but many of our federal agents who were trying to control us and trying to control the way that we lived in the world told us that if we truly wanted to be treated as a civilized people, that we had to write down our laws in English, just like the white man did. And because of our struggles to survive, we agreed. We acquiesced to that request. And largely what happened in that time period was that we wrote down our laws and often copied what we saw in the state or federal statute books. Because, again, if we're going to be assimilated, why not? But when I found this rape law, I found something that didn't exist in white laws in 1824, and certainly never existed in white laws in Europe. And that is that in 1824, we wrote down that if somebody assaults a woman, it's up to her. What she say, it be law. Now, I know that didn't come from the state codes. I know that didn't come from the federal codes. That had to come from our traditions. That a woman would be honored in a way to understand that they believed her and that they honored her and that they abided by her wishes. So I believe that at least in my people's history, and every other history that I have researched over the last 25 years, is that Native women were treated with respect and dignity, and that we were not victims of violence in the way that we are today. So the next question is, what has happened to us? Today we suffer from the highest rates of violence in the nation, but we didn't always. We had laws that protected us, that honored us. So where a white man lived among us for 10 years and said he never even saw a Native woman being treated with disrespect. What has happened to us that we have now almost 85% of our women have been victims of violence? What has happened to us? And it's time to tell the truth about what has happened to us. And it begins at the beginning. From first contact. And I know we put a lot of blame on Columbus because he's the symbol of Western imperialism. But he also raped us, literally, and we have to mark that. The shipmates of Columbus bragged heartily in their journals about raping Native women from the moment they set foot on our shores. So I often talk to journalists or filmmakers who say, well, when did this all get started? How bad has it been? And I always say, well, it's been bad for over 500 years. That's where it started, right? My own people, the Creek Nation people, were removed forcibly from our homelands at gunpoint, at bayonet point, from the southeastern part of the United States to what is now Oklahoma, in a journey that we now call the Road of Suffering. We still call the Mississippi River the River of Death because our people were forcibly removed and put on barges that sank in the Mississippi River. What we often don't talk about in this Trail of Tears era is, yes, we lost our land, yes, we lost elders, and we lost babies along the way. And that's bad enough. But we were also being gang raped by soldiers on the Trail of Tears. And you'll find that if you look into the stories and you look into the missionary records. Gang rape of Native women every night on the Trail of Tears. We have to tell that truth. Removal happened all over the United States and Canada. And we often only think about the Trail of Tears in the Southeast, but we were moved everywhere, back and forth to where the white government wanted us to be. This is a picture from the Southwest of Navajo or Dene women who were being held captive by the Army in the 1860s. Now, we don't know much about this picture. We don't know who these women are, who these girls are, and we don't know exactly what the circumstances were other than that they were under control of the Army. But as a former rape crisis worker myself, when I look at this picture, I see some very familiar faces and blank stares and vacant stares of people that I believe were also victims of sexual violence. In the 1860s, there were wars. There was a war in Minnesota called the U.S. Dakota War of 1862. At the end of that war, the U.S. Army took all the women and children of that community, of that nation, and put us in an internment camp at Fort Snelling in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we were under guard there. The Dakota women were under guard there for at least 2 winters, where many of them starved to death and died in the cold. But again, they were also being sexually assaulted, and we have to tell that truth. We often acknowledge, I think we've come we've come to some understanding, I think, as a nation about the land loss that has happened to our people. And when you lose land, you lose your economy, and you lose your places to prey, and you lose your hunting grounds. There's a lot of things that you lose, but what I really like to emphasize about land loss is that for victims of trauma, whether they're a victim of child abuse or sexual violence or domestic violence, or perhaps have served overseas in the military, because our people volunteer for the military at rates much higher than any other group in this country, is that our places of worship are not churches or places or school or buildings. Our places of worship are land. And so today, if you are a victim of violence and you're a Native person, you may not have access to the place where your ancestors have prayed for thousands of years. and how to find solace in a world where your own connection to your God and your Creator is cut off because of stolen lands and broken treaties. One of the most brutal policies of the federal government was the boarding school era, which lasted from the 1880s to as late as the 1970s. It was thought that Native children would be better off if they were just taught to be white and forget who they were and forget their name and forget their language and forget their faith. And that's bad enough. But these children were also being sexually assaulted by church and government-run boarding school officials. I want to show you a before and after picture. This is some children, Apache children in Arizona, and this is them just a few months later, the same group. This is the before picture, and notice, if you can see there, who took that picture. It was the United States Army, who was tasked with gathering these children and forcing them to Pennsylvania from Arizona, where they were forcibly put in uniforms. Their hair was cut. They were told to deny everything about them that was Indian. In fact, the motto of this school was "Kill the Indian, save the man." Kill the Indian, save the man. And we know that these children were sexually assaulted because there was nobody to check on these children. And even the people who went to boarding schools in the 60s and 70s have reported widespread sexual abuse perpetrated by both men and women in these schools. The other thing that happened to us, every once in a while, a rare thing would happen, and Native people would be wealthy for a period. It happened to the Osage people when they found oil on the reservation. It happened to small pockets of Indian people across the country when valuable resources were found on the land that they had been promised. But even then, we were not safe from predators. Even then, we were subject to the harsh reality of white homicide against Native people. And this was one example. Dusky maidens are in demand from the Daily Oklahoma in 1910, where a Native woman, could actually get her husband riches if he married her. And oftentimes, the white men who married us would actually commit homicide against us so they have access to our resources and our wealth. In the 1950s and the 1960s, the federal government engaged in yet another brutal policy, and that was forced urban migration and termination of tribal governments. We were told that if we just left the reservation, we wouldn't have to deal with poverty anymore, that everything would be okay if we went to Denver or Albuquerque or Los Angeles or New York or Wichita or Minneapolis, that's where we needed to be able to hold a real job and get a real education. And so we did, many of us did, and they bought us one-way bus tickets. And if things didn't work out, if we didn't have a job or we didn't have an apartment, we were stuck because the BIA would not send us home, even for funerals of loved ones. What we have to understand in this time period is this is when I think contemporary sex trafficking of Native women really began, because there were so many of us living in the cities with no social safety net. There were no social workers looking out for us. The cities just watched us deteriorate into the city. And many of us were pimped and bought and sold in that time period. That dynamic continues today in the form of man camps at extraction sites and pipeline development. Many, many tribal citizens have reported that when man camps come in, and man camps is a phrase that refers to the transient or short-term housing that is needed to house thousands and thousands of pipeline and oil workers while they're there extracting resources. And these man camps, there's very little policing going on. There's very little law enforcement engagement with these man camps. And so Native women and children are being kidnapped, drugged, raped, and sometimes sold back and forth in these man camps with no intervention and no safety. And I believe this is one of the reasons why we have such high rates of missing women and high rates of murdered women, unsolved murders, is because of this continued historical trauma and this continued effort to extinguish us and get us off our lands and take our children away. So now I want to tell you some good news, because we're still here. My favorite story from the 19th century about Native women is this wonderful figure named Sarah Winnemucca. And Sarah Winnemucca was a Paiute woman who was a truth teller. And she was trying to raise money for a school for her children, the children of the Paiute people. She had some wealth and she had some knowledge. She spoke 5 languages, as far as those are the ones we know about. And she decided to try to raise money on the East Coast from sympathetic white East Coaster people. I don't know if that's a word, East Coast people. So she dressed up in her regalia. Sometimes the white organizers of her lectures called her a princess, which was not true, but she said, whatever I can get in the door with. But what was so powerful about Sarah Winnemucca is that she wrote a book. She was the first Native woman in the United States to write a book. It's called Life Among the Paiutes, and it's still available today. In fact, it's out of copyright, so you can actually get free versions online. And her story, is nonfiction work called Life Among the Paiutes, The Wrongs and Claims, was a detailed book about everything that had been done to her people, everything that she had seen done to her people as a result of colonial power and control. And what's so powerful about this book is that Sarah Winnemucca in 1883 is writing explicitly about sexual violence being perpetrated against her people, her sisters, her aunts, the community. And I find that inspirational because in 1883, it wasn't safe for white women to be talking about rape and sexual assault. And yet here, we have a Native woman, one of the most marginalized faces on the continent, who is not only speaking about it, but writing about it as well. And that gives me hope. In fact, one of the things I have found frustrating in my work as a former rape crisis worker myself is that we often, when I would get trained, this was back in the 1990s, I was taught and told that the rape crisis movement in the United States began in the late 1960s or early 1970s. And now that I know about Sarah Winnemucca and other women like her, I want to reclaim that and say the rape crisis movement in this country began with Native women who spoke out and wrote about our experiences. And I want to tell you again about the resiliency of our people. This is a picture of Lisa Marie Ayotte, who is a Native woman who spoke at the signing of the Tribal Law and Order Act, which was signed by Obama in July of 2010. And Lisa Marie Ayotte is a survivor of brutal sexual assault that took place in front of her children on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. But she introduced the president. She was on stage first, and she told the story and the truth of what had happened to her and her people. And it was a sign of true resilience. When the Violence Against Women Act was signed in March of 2013, after a long, drawn-out fight in Congress to get provisions to support the lives of Native women and children, Diane Millich spoke at the signing. She was victimized by her white husband, who actually shot and tried to kill her. And the police in her community could do nothing about it because he was white and because tribes have been stripped of the authority to prosecute non-Indians. But she survived to tell her story so that Congress would take notice and change the law, and they did. And today, tribal nations have the opportunity to prosecute non-Indians who commit acts like Diane Millich's ex-husband did. And so her story has changed America. We have to fight all over the place when we're Indians. We have to fight at the state level, we have to fight at the local level, we have to fight at the national level. And we've been doing a lot of work with Congress and getting Congress to pass laws that provide these changes that are needed to our laws. But we also have to fight in the Supreme Court. Every year, the Supreme Court takes a dozen or so Indian law cases and hears them. And we don't have a great win-loss record with the Supreme Court, which is too bad. But I've been working with your next speaker, Mary Catherine Nagel, for the last 5 years to make sure that when the Supreme Court decides an Indian law case, they don't forget about the stories that Native women have been telling. And we've documented that and filed briefs on behalf of Native women's organizations so that the court is required then to take heed of our stories and the truth that we tell. And when we worked on a case called Dollar General versus Mississippi Choctaw, there was a groundswell of a grassroots movement that showed up at the court that day of the oral argument to make a statement that we were worth more than $1, that we were worth something to this country, and that we deserve justice. And this case ended in a tie, but we could have lost it. And I truly believe that the voices of Native women, as long as they're being amplified and upheld, are going to change the world. So what is historical resilience? We often talk about historical trauma in Indian country, the fact that we've sort of carried this burden, these psychological harms that have been done or passed down generation to generation. And that's a true story, but I think it's time for a new story. And that's why we talk about historical resilience, not historical trauma. It's a message of hope, courage, faith, and persistence, and it is at the core of why someone decides to heal. So when I think about Sarah Winnemucca, and I think about Lisa Marie Ayotte, and I think about Diane Millich, and I think about all of the Native women who have taught me what the truth really is, I believe that this is the true hallmark of historical resilience. And now I want you to think about those red numbers that I put up at the beginning of my presentation, those harsh, dehumanizing, difficult, painful numbers. And now I would like to ask every Native woman in this room to please stand. This is who we are. We are not numbers. We are not statistics. This is who we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for those very powerful words.